In June and early July, my partner Jeanette and I were traveling through Ireland, Scotland, and England. Many of you know that between us we had COVID for 13 of the 26 days we were gone. The result of that was that we missed an 8-day retreat on peace building that we had anticipated for 9 months. In addition, we spent extra money, had to find accommodations at the very last minute, and had done zero research because the whole thing had been planned for that 8 days. When a spouse gets COVID, it's really tough not to begin to question what that person did to get COVID. I had it first, and Jeanette really didn't want it, but 2 days after I tested positive, she tested positive as well. You can imagine the disappointment and the temptation to blame that we mostly avoided. Neither one of us was in our best state of mind or being when we finally tested negative and flew from Belfast to Glasgow. We had planned on leaving Belfast full of great peace-building ideas and motivation, and instead, we're just ready to get the heck out of there and begin to feel better. We flew on a small airline that charged for everything. I'm sure you've all flown on them. I had 2 backpacks, one that was a large version of a school backpack and one that was very light and much smaller. When I got to the boarding area, one of the employees insisted my backpack was too big to fit under the seat and said I had to pay an additional $70. This was after the 8 days of paying for everything we hadn't counted on paying for. It's important to set the stage for my behavior. If I could fit my backpack into the box they had, I wouldn't have to pay. So I rearranged a few things. I held a couple things in my hand, like my book and my water bottle, and then I put it in the box again. It bulged a little bit, but mostly it fit. The employee that insisted I pay the $70 was not the one who saw me fit it back into the box. That other employee let me get back into the line. I was almost at the front, close to boarding, and the guy who originally saw it came all the way over and told me I had to get out of line and pay. I told him I put it in the box again and it was okay. He insisted I show him. Of course, when I showed him, he didn't allow for the little bulges that were not quite in the box. He said I had to pay. And that was when I finally lost it. I looked at him and said, if I remember right, a little bit loudly, I have no idea why you are singling me out and treating me like this. I have watched you let others go through with backpacks of similar size and that also don't fit exactly in the box. I don't appreciate how you are treating me. I have a right to carry a book and a water bottle and a pillow in my hands. I am not paying an additional $70. The other employee who let me go through was standing with him and looked a little embarrassed. After my outburst, I put my backpack in the box, shoved it as hard as I could, and said, "See, I told you it fits." I then grabbed it and walked back into line. I was very angry, and my tone and body language reflected it. Choosing love over hate is rarely in the making history kinds of ways, and is more often in the small, day-to-day interactions we have with people. The kind of hatred that leads to violence can often be traced back to words. And the kind of love that leads to nonviolence can often be traced back to words. Communication is as critical to nonviolence as the decision to commit oneself to living nonviolently. Several years ago, we invited Dr. Teresa Latini to come and lead a one-day workshop on nonviolent communication. What we learned in that workshop was that as much as we want to blame our feelings and therefore our reactions on the person who has just done or said something, how we feel in any particular situation is not about what has happened, but about what our own needs are in any given moment. In the airport example, I was feeling anger at the injustice of having to pay more money than I already had, and I was feeling very annoyed by the employee who seemed to be singling me out for some reason. I could easily say, "He made me so mad and annoyed, he got what was coming." But those who teach nonviolent communication would say, as soon as I have that thought, it is a small step from there to violence. As soon as I blame another for my feelings, I am choosing hate over love. Instead, if I could understand my anger as a warning sign and ask myself the question, what is my unmet need right now? I could respond entirely differently. I am not skilled in being able to identify my needs on the spot. I'm working on it. Looking back, I can see I had several needs that day. I needed some ease because everything had felt so difficult up to that point. I needed compassion because I was still feeling a little low. And I needed choice about where and how I spent money, since I had just spent 8 days worth of money that I had not planned on spending. Instead of using my angriest tone with the employee and accusing him of singling me out and treating me poorly, I wonder what would have happened if I had had the presence of mind and body and spirit to say, I realize it's a little bigger than it's supposed to be. I'll do what I can to make it smaller because I know you're trying to do your job. I've just had a really difficult 8 days in Ireland, and I hope you'll show me some compassion. It's possible he would have held to his demands because there are people that are just rule followers. But I'll never know if maybe he would have actually showed me some compassion, because I certainly didn't give him the chance. We don't see many examples in our lives of people who daily choose love, who are committed to living nonviolence even in their communication, and who are able to disagree with people without hating them or categorizing them. Interestingly, in the run-up to the election for governor in Utah in 2020, so think about that election, the Democratic and Republican nominees for governor got together and made an ad jointly in the final weeks leading up to the election. Spencer Cox was the Republican lieutenant governor and was now running for governor. He was so tired of seeing the divisiveness in politics playing out in the media, on social media, and everywhere he turned, and even in families. He got a wild idea one day, and he called his opponent, the Democratic candidate, Chris Peterson, and asked if he'd be willing to do an ad with him. And now we're going to look at the ad they ran in the final weeks of the 2020 election for governor in Utah. And remember, those of you on the live stream, you have a link on the YouTube page.
I'm Chris Peterson, and I'm Spencer Cox. We are currently in the final days of campaigning against each other to be your next governor.
And while I think you should vote for me,
Yeah, but really you should vote for me.
there are some things we both agree on.
We can debate issues without degrading each other's character. We can disagree without hating each other. And win or lose in Utah, we work together. So let's show the country that there's a better way. My name's Chris Peterson. And I'm Spencer Cox. And we approve this message.
Pretty unusual. Spencer Cox, the Republican, won the election, and he's still governor of Utah. He did a TED Talk in April this year about the discouragement that led to his wild idea, why his opponent said yes, and how we all need to find ways to love our political enemies. He ended his TED Talk by saying, "We must rise up and meet that radical call to love our enemies, even especially our political opponents." It's not an easy answer, but it's a simple one. If we really want to change the world, we have to start by changing our own hearts. We seem to be speaking the same language and reading the same Bible as this Republican governor. What we're talking about with this fifth principle is how to change our hearts by beginning with the smallest of changes in communication and the ways we speak about others. Have you ever known anyone who you marvel at because they never say a negative word about other people? I have known a handful of people like that in my life, and I am always so amazed by them. I wish I were more like them. I aspire to be more like them. If I'm really committed to nonviolent communication, it means that I'm not labeling, name-calling, deriding, criticizing, judging, calling out, or saying how much I can't stand that person. In nonviolent communication, if I really had a beef with someone, I would talk with them directly and compassionately, stating the facts of what happened, sharing my feelings about what happened, stating my needs that are contributing to my feelings about it, and then making a request of them for concrete action. This kind of communication is really difficult because we are often so reactive and unaware of our unmet needs, which is a tough combination. And when we don't communicate like this, we are in danger of contributing to the violence all around us. In Dr. King's book, Stride for Freedom, which I've been reading from throughout this series, there's a powerful story about betrayal in the Montgomery bus boycott movement. A little more than 6 months after it was in full effect, instead of having the movement threatened by those on the outside, it was threatened by someone on the inside who was actually part of the movement. After local judges decided that the bus segregation laws were unconstitutional, the city of Montgomery appealed the decision and it went to the Supreme Court. Right around that time, Reverend U.J. Fields made a statement to the press claiming that he was resigning as recording secretary of the Montgomery Improvement Association, what they call the MIA. He was the pastor of Bell Street Baptist Church, and he had been an officer of the MIA from the beginning. When he announced his resignation, he claimed that members of the association were misusing money sent from all over the nation and even the world, and that they were using it for their own purposes. He accused the leaders of taking on an air of bigness and being too egotistical and being interested in perpetuating themselves. He said he wanted nothing more to do with them because they no longer represented what he stood for, and they were an example of the many exploiting the few. At the time he made his statement, Dr. King was on a rare vacation. He quickly learned the truth of what happened, Reverend Fields had not been reelected to his position as recording secretary by the board, and when he tried to appeal to the entire audience at that election, they unanimously approved the board's decision. He was so angry that he left that meeting and prepared his attack on the MIA. Due to the seriousness of the allegations, Dr. King returned from his vacation. He was concerned about the white people who were working against them, using the opportunity to try to freeze their funds. And he was also concerned for the personal safety for Reverend Fields by people in the movement who had already spent 6 months walking to and from work. People were so angry with Reverend Fields that his own congregation had met and voted him out. At some point in the process, Reverend Fields privately confessed to a few people that he deeply regretted what he had done. Dr. King received a phone call the day after he returned to Montgomery, and it was Reverend Fields asking to meet. He said to Dr. King, "I want you to know that I was not referring to you in my accusations. I've always had the greatest respect for your integrity, and I still do. But there are some members of the MIA board that I don't care for at all. We could never get along." Dr. King interrupted him and said, "You mean that your statements about the egotism of the leaders grew out of a personal conflict between you and 1 or 2 other men on the board?" The answer was yes. Reverend Fields went on to admit that he knew of no misappropriation of funds, but that he had made it up in a moment of anger and said it to retaliate against the board. Dr. King asked if he would be willing to make the same statement in a mass meeting that evening, and Reverend Fields agreed. People started lining up for the meeting at 3 p.m., and the place was completely full by 5 p.m. When the meeting started at 7 p.m., people were muttering about the devil sitting next to Dr. King. Dr. King knew that he had to do 2 things that night: convince the crowd that no misappropriation had occurred, and convince the crowd to forgive Reverend Fields. He began talking about Reverend Fields by expressing regret at the statement he had made and the problems it had caused. And then Dr. King said this: "We must meet this situation with the same dignity and discipline with which we have met so many difficult situations in the past. Let us never forget that we have committed ourselves to a way of nonviolence, and nonviolence means avoiding not only external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. You not only refuse to shoot a man, but you refuse to hate him. Now, in the spirit of our nonviolent movement, I call upon you to forgive the Reverend Fields." When he was met with resistance, he went on to say, "We are all aware of the weaknesses of human nature. We have all made mistakes along the way of life, and we have all had moments when our emotions overpowered us. Now, some of us are here this evening to stone one of our brothers because he has made a mistake. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Will we be like the unforgiving elder brother, or will we, in the Spirit of Christ, follow the example of the loving and forgiving Father in that parable?" Reverend Fields then got up and asked the crowd for forgiveness, and in the end, he was forgiven and even reinstated to his church. I love that example because of how many different principles had to be put into play in that situation. Jesus taught in a variety of ways and places that we are to live in love toward those we count as enemies. The reason I wanted us to hear Eugene Peterson's interpretation in the Message is because he says that what that looks like in practice is having your enemies bring out the best in you instead of the worst. That's what love instead of hate looks like. Regardless of whether someone begins as a friend and then becomes an enemy, the same thing applies. How can we be our true God-created selves? How can we not blame everyone else for how we are feeling, but live into awareness of our own needs and how our needs then impact our behavior? We've talked before about the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Some of our most basic needs are tied to feeling these things. When we feel them, we are at risk of being less than our best selves. If you have a difficult time knowing your need in any given moment, you can ask yourself if you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. I have a hard time distinguishing between hungry and tired. It's something I'm working on. When you think about your daily life or an average week, how can you identify the times or places or ways in which your enemy brings out the worst in you? Is it during times of transition? Is it when you are most tired? Is it in the hour after you have read or watched news? Is it when you are most anxious, and is that tied to time of day? Is there a particular person who tends to bring out the worst in you? If you can take some time to come to awareness, you can begin the next step of changing your behavior. When there are times, and there are, when someone else's behavior is unacceptable, you can talk with them about it by using nonviolent communication rather than attacking or accusing or blaming them. Many years ago, right here in this sanctuary, we had a difficult church meeting because of a personnel issue. There were some things that had transpired that not everyone in the congregation knew about. At the meeting, a few people were angry and wanted to know what I had done to make this person resign so suddenly. I was leading the meeting, and at one point I could feel myself starting to get defensive. Fortunately, I had been reviewing nonviolent communication and mediation and some of the other tools I had learned and even taught over time. So when I felt myself wanting to lash out about the accusations made and defend every decision I had made, I decided instead to practice nonviolent communication. I said to the entire congregation that I was feeling defensive and needed a minute to get myself back on track. When I spoke again, I spoke with a much more calm voice and spirit, and I was able to address the concerns without defending myself. The situation was diffused, which I attribute to everyone, and we went on to have an honest and productive conversation. What could have been a very divisive moment in our congregation turned out to be more unifying, and it gave us confidence in the ensuing years that when difficult things happen, we can actually talk openly and honestly about those things. We came together rather than apart, in part because of the efficacy of nonviolent communication. Choosing love over hate, letting our enemies bring out the best in us, praying for those who work our last nerves, loving those who make it really hard, growing up, as Eugene Peterson says, living like God has called us, and living generously and graciously toward others will never be easy. Not ever. Because I have not yet used an Olympic example, I'm going to use gymnastics because, holy smokes, what a team. Making the choice to love rather than hate is similar to walking our entire lives on a balance beam with so many distractions, weather conditions, health issues, and so many other factors threatening constantly to knock us off balance. We will lose our balance often, but part of the discipline of committing to nonviolence is steadying ourselves again and sticking with it. No one gets a gold medal without making mistake after mistake, without falling off again and again, without losing their balance over and over, and committing every single time to getting back on and taking another step in balance. If we believe God has called and is calling us to nonviolence in order to create a world with a beloved community, we will keep at it day after day, hour after hour, knowing that the reward in the end is more than worth it. Amen.